Hi there. Let's talk about Dawkins on God versus the gods. I'm Eric Steinhardt, and you can learn more about me and my work at my website, www.ericsteinhardt.com. This video is based on my new book, Believing in Dawkins, which shows how to use ideas from Dawkins to build a new and existentially satisfying naturalistic culture. It does not debate God, it builds a new spiritual atheism, and Believing in Dawkins is published by Palgrave Macmillan. You can learn more about it at my website, ericsteinhardt.com. So let's get into it. Dawkins starts by defining gods in the God delusion. There he is, there's the book. And in the book, Dawkins says gods don't devolve. He says, by definition, gods are supernatural and gods don't evolve. Supernatural things don't evolve. So, superhuman aliens, if they came and visited us, would be godlike but not gods. And a cosmic computer that might be running our universe as a simulation would not be a god. It might be godlike but not a god, because those things are natural and not supernatural, and they would have somehow evolved, or their designers would have evolved. So they would not be gods. Now this is Dawkins' Boing 747 Gambit. He says, God is complex. Complex things come into being either by luck, evolution, or design. God didn't come into being by luck. By definition, God didn't evolve. And so God was designed. That's the only option left. Now designers are more complex than their products. God was designed by a more complex super God because designers are more complex. And so now there's a regression of ever greater, that is, ever more complex super gods. And more complex things have lesser probabilities, according to Dawkins. So the regression of supergods regresses to zero probability. Therefore, God was not designed either. Since God didn't come about through luck or through evolution or through design, God does not exist. There are 6 problems with this. The first comes from polytheism, then there's a problem from monotheism, problem from philosophical definitions, a problem from actual religions, one from Dawkins himself, and the species-genus error. So, what about polytheism? Well, polytheistic religions generally presented their gods as evolving biologically. Here's a genealogy of the Sumero-Akkadian gods. It's very complicated. It's got like 9 generations of gods there. Here's a quick genealogy of the Greek Olympian gods, right? And the Titans too, Greek polytheism, starting from chaos and maybe old night. And we go through 7 or 8 generations there. There's Norse polytheism. There's a number of different origins there. Again, 7 or 8 or 9 different generations. These gods have genealogies. They have family trees, right? There's Mayan polytheism, a few generations of their deities. Polytheistic gods evolved, and oftentimes the first deity is a kind of simplicity, right? It's not even a person or a god in that sense. In Greece, it's chaos or night. In the Norse religion and genealogies, we have Niflheim and Muspelheim. Niflheim is just a region of cold which surrounds Muspelheim, a region of heat, and they interact, producing warmth. And the first god Myr a kind of giant actually, emerges from their interaction. This could in fact be a long evolutionary process. The same with the Greek chaos into the first deities. And the gods in their generations, once they do emerge, they have descent with modification. They have something like selection via wars, right? The Titans versus the Olympians, in which the Olympians win out and the Titans are consigned to lesser roles or disappear. In the Norse mythologies, you have the Aesir versus the Vanir, right? And once again, a kind of selection. And so it seems like gods evolve, at least polytheistic gods evolve. And that would contradict what Dawkins says about gods by definition not evolving, because surely the polytheistic gods were gods. And in polytheism, the gods have bodies. The gods make love. Here's Zeus and Hera. They're about to get busy. The gods make war. Here's Athena, beating Ares to the ground, right? And Zeus has to intervene lest she kill him or destroy him, right? The extraordinary war goddess Athena. The gods make war. Gods have families. Here's lovely Shiva with his wonderful wife Parvati and their 2 children, 2 of their children. They have bodies, they had sex, they have families, they have kids. And gods can die, especially in the Norse mythology, right? Here's Balder, who died. And of course, here's the wolf Renfir, or excuse me, Fenrir, who's going to attack and kill and devour Odin in Ragnarok. Gods can die. Gods can come back to life, of course, sure, why not? But they can die. Polytheism is naturalistic. The polytheistic gods are always portrayed as natural. They have bodies in the universe, right? They are not creators of the universe. They have families, they have sex, they have kids, they fight, they maybe even kill each other. And the lesson from this is not all gods are the Abrahamic God. And it looks like Dawkins is basing his definition incorrectly on the Abrahamic God, because not all gods are the Abrahamic God. And even so, in Abrahamic monotheism, God often is said to evolve internally. Here's Jakob Boehme, right? A sort of old picture there and a diagram there of his system somehow, right? The book that he wrote about God beginning with this nothingness. Initially, God is the abyss of nothingness. And within this abyss, there is this dynamical process in which a greater and more complex God comes to be out of nothingness. And surely nothing is simple in a Dawkinsian sense. Jakob Boehme's sort of internal evolution of God would seem to satisfy Dawkins' requirements that complex things evolve. God began again as a simple nothingness and evolves internally to infinite complexity. Process Theology of Charles Hartshorne there on the left. One of his books, The Logic of Perfection. And again, God starts simple, God evolves through stages of ever greater complexity and greatness, and God evolves forever. This would seem to satisfy Dawkins' demands about God having to evolve. Even in Catholic theology, there's Peter Forrest, a wonderful philosopher from Australia who wrote a book, Developmental Theism, From Pure Will to Unbounded Love. And God starts simple as a kind of pure will, much like Jakob Boehme, and God evolves internally into a complex personal being. Again, this would seem to satisfy the Dawkinsian demands that complex things evolve. Pantheists think that God is the universe, and you can see sort of a picture of the history of the universe so far. The universe, right, starts out simple, evolves internally to higher levels of complexity. So for a pantheist, God evolves eternally. Here's Mormonism. The Mormon God has a body of flesh and bone. Mormons are explicit. Joseph Smith was explicit about that. The Mormon God has parents and has children. Mormonism actually is a variety, apparently, of Abrahamic monotheism, which is really kind of like polytheism. It's very complicated. But the point being that God has a genealogy even within Mormonism. So there are lots of monotheists who say that God evolves. They say God starts simple and grows more complex. And so not all gods, not even all Abrahamic gods, are like the classical theistic God. It's the God of classical theism that doesn't evolve. It's the God of classical theism that is an eternal, necessary being. Right, that doesn't have any mom or dad, doesn't have any lineage, doesn't have any genealogy, that simply somehow exists eternally the same forever. That's not just one kind of Abrahamic God, it's just one kind of God. Right? There are lots of polytheistic gods that aren't like that, and lots of Abrahamic gods that aren't like that. This is a very, very narrow conception of God. There are philosophical definitions of gods, right? Richard Swinburne, he's a Christian theologian, and he says a God, he didn't say capital G God, but he defines a God, little g, as a very powerful, free, non-embodied rational agent. And that's in his essay on the argument from design. There's no mention about naturalism or supernaturalism, and no mention about whether this gods have to evolve or don't evolve. And here, of course, he's thinking about all kinds of gods, not just the Christian God, because Swinburne knows very well that there are other kinds of gods. Let's turn quickly to actual religions, right? Here's Raelianism, some Raelians. Raelianism is a UFO religion, and they think that the gods were aliens. And there are lots of other UFO religions, like Scientology and Heaven's Gate. There are some AI religions. Here's Hugo de Garis, wrote a fascinating book, The Art-elect War, between the cosmists and the terrorists. And according to Garis, right, he describes the art-elects, which are super intelligent AIs, right, designed and constructed first by humans and then by other AIs. And they have a long evolutionary history, right? Going back to the first computers long ago. And Garris describes them as gods. There's Ray Kurzweil, who talks about, gods in his book, The Singularity is Near, and AI kinds of gods. He pictures the universe as evolving into a divine computer. And he says, does God exist? Well, not yet. And so Kurzweil's God is coming into being. It's evolving from simplicity to complexity, a final kind of omega state of the universe, and it's an artificial intelligence, and it would be God. Now, there's a species genus error that Dawkins makes, and that's really a problem when you define things. Look at Shiva. Here's Shiva. Shiva is a god, and Shiva is blue. Now, suppose that's Shiva and Vishnu, by the way, Vishnu on the left. Suppose you said all gods are blue. You look at Shiva and you just think, well, Shiva's a god. Everybody worships Shiva, right? Shiva's a god. That's what God means. And so if something's a god, it's blue. That's by definition. I mean, right? Shiva's a god. Shiva is God. That's God, Shiva. Well, that would lead immediately to saying that Vishnu is not God. Vishnu's not blue. And look at this guy, the Christian God, right? In quotes there, because now we have a definition. We have to ask, is it blue? No. And therefore, by definition, it's not a god. So an error was made here, and it's the error of replacing a genus with one of its species by taking a wide and broad definition of something and saying, oh, I'm just going to pick one example of that thing and use that to define the whole genus. That's a logical mistake in defining. So the concept of an eternal, unchanging, necessary deity, a supernatural deity, and a deity who doesn't evolve, is just one concept of a god. It's a very narrow concept of God. It's generally known as classical theism. It doesn't generalize, right? The Hindu gods, the Greek gods, the Norse gods, the Aztec gods, the gods of process theology, the god of Jakob Boehme, the god of Catholic theologians like Peter Forrest, the god of Mormonism, right? Those are not the gods of classical theism. Classical theism, they're the sort of the eye of providence, right? The all-seeing eye, and the triangle, I guess the Trinity, and the rays coming out like light, this circle of infinity. This classical theistic God is just one God among many. It doesn't generalize. You can't use that to represent the entire genus of gods. It would be like using a firefly to represent the entire genus of living things. It's not definitional. And atheists shouldn't normalize it. When atheists normalize this God, they make it into the standard. That's a capitulation to classical theism. And atheists shouldn't be classical theists, and atheists shouldn't use the definitions of classical theism. So that's an error that Dawkins made. But let's look at Dawkins himself. What does Dawkins himself say? At one point in an article written 25 years ago now, in 1995, he writes a reply to a Christian writer, Poole, and Michael Poole, and he says, okay, here's my reply to Poole's article. And Dawkins himself says, okay, God doesn't come from luck, God doesn't come from design. And he says, why do I jump right away to who designed God? Because no theologian, to my knowledge, has ever proposed that God evolved to his awesome complexity by slow, gradual degrees. Then he says it would have to be a population of randomly varying gods, by the way, if natural selection was the driving force. If any such suggestion were made, I should be intrigued and would give the hypothesis my best attention. But I'm not optimistic that the hypothesis has much satisfaction to offer the religious. And then Dawkins says a few things. Well, I mean, it's unfortunate that Dawkins is not aware of this, because there are lots of theologians who have proposed that God evolved to his awesome complexity by slow, gradual degrees. Right? And of course, the older those would be process theologians, etc. And of course, the polytheists talked about populations of varying gods. I don't know if they vary randomly, but if you look at the great diversity of body shapes and forms among, say, the Norse gods, the Greek gods, and the Hindu gods and the Egyptian gods, you would see these gods have great variety of body forms, great phenotypic variation. Thoth has the head of an ibis. Poseidon is part fish, right? So, okay, these gods have varying body forms, varying phenotypes. They have parents, they have genealogies, they have family trees, right? They seem to be evolving things. And I don't know, again, if natural selection is proper to say that that's the driving force for them, but they certainly do seem to persist and reproduce under some selectional forces. Right. Okay, so Dawkins himself, even if we exclude all the other considerations, Dawkins himself says that if there were a suggestion of a population of evolving gods, he would give it his full attention, his best attention. Right, so Dawkins himself at this point, right, isn't following he had an earlier definition, and later he makes a different definition, which is wrong. The definition or the approach he's giving here in his reply to Poole, that really is satisfactory if we compare that to polytheisms, to other forms of Abrahamic monotheism, and so on. Let's rerun the argument. Boing. It says God is complex now, still the same. Complex things come into being by luck, evolution, or design. God didn't come into being by luck. That's either evolution or design. If God was evolved, then the designers evolved, or rather, if God was designed, then the designers evolved. And so if God was designed, God came to be through evolution. Obviously, if God evolved, then God evolved. That means the only way for God to come to be is through evolution. But the God of classical theism does not evolve. And most versions of the Abrahamic God do not evolve. Consequently, those gods do not exist. But it's consistent with what Dawkins says about gods elsewhere, including his article responding to Poole, that a population of evolving and thus natural gods might exist. So that's an interesting thought that a Dawkinsian has to consider. Right? Those gods would not be supernatural. They would be natural evolving things. I think about some of those topics in my book, Believing in Dawkins, The New Spiritual Atheism, and it doesn't debate God. It considers all kinds of hypotheses and how Dawkins relates to them, right? And its goal is to build a new spiritual atheism that's a new and existentially satisfying kind of naturalistic culture. You can learn more about it at my website, ericsteinhardt.com. Thank you very much.